Sir Ronald Harwood, thank you so much for joining us on Muse Park today.
My pleasure.
We're here to talk about the forces that drive people to create. And essentially you've been creating and writing since your 20s. You're now in your 70s, 50 years later, and you're still going strong, winning Academy Awards, BAFTA Awards, being nominated and so forth. What is the secret of your creative energy?
Self-discipline is a very great part of the creative process. I get up every morning at the same time, have done for 50 years. It sounds so boring, but I love it. I love getting up, getting ready and going to my desk. And I've never had a writer's block, thank God. I sit at my desk and I write. I was given wonderful advice when I was a young writer starting out. I was fortunate enough to meet Graham Greene, great English writer. And he said to me, always stop when it's going well. And I've tried to do it. It's not always possible, but I've tried to do it. And it's just wonderful because the next morning you come back to it and you know where you are.
Right.
And I think it's like being an athlete. You have to keep the muscles fit. And by writing, that's what you do. And
Right.
so it's a process of discipline and focusing whatever energy you have into that work. Well, that's how I've done it. I don't think it's the same for everybody, because I know really gifted writers who don't do what I do.
Right.
But that's what I do.
Well, it's working for you. So.
Works for me, yes. That's all I can say, yes.
You actually started out as an actor, not as a writer. But since then you've become world famous for your plays and your screenplays. What would you say sparked the transition from actor to writer?
Oh, it's very easy and very, very banal.
Okay.
A gift from my father-in-law of a typewriter. I was out of work as an actor. My wife Natasha was pregnant with our first child, and I was about to take work on a building site to earn some money. And he gave me the typewriter. In November is my birthday, and my father-in-law gave me a typewriter. He was director of an office machinery company, and it was called a Facet. It was a Swedish typewriter in a beautiful leather case. And I started to type, and I found I was typing a novel. I know it sounds strange, I've never analysed it, but in 3 weeks I'd finished a novel about South Africa where I was born called All the Same Shadows. And I knew when I finished it, I had to get up from the desk and catch my breath. I was hyperventilating. I know it sounds as if I'm mystifying something. I'd like to demystify it, but I can't. And I paced up and down our little flat and trying to catch my breath, and I knew I was onto something in myself that I'd never known before, some new sensation in me. And a friend of ours came to dinner and he asked me what I'd been doing, and I said, oh, I've written a book. And he said, oh, I know, publisher. And so he gave it to the publisher, who turned out to be Jonathan Cape, a very distinguished British publisher. They published the book. It was published in America, and that was that.
The rest of history.
And I then wrote a television play, and I loved writing. I found the actual act of writing. In those days, I wrote by hand. Well, now with computers, it's entirely different, but I still love the act of writing.
Right. How's it different when you sort of write by hand as opposed to when you...
Well, on the computer screen is very different because it's always perfect. On a piece of paper, when you cross out and you put in inserts and you correct spelling and all that, you don't do that on a computer.
Right.
It always looks wonderful. I find I have to print it out about 10 pages at a time, and then I make huge corrections, change things around, fiddle. It looks quite different. I think it's because of the practice that I had as a younger writer. But it's just part of, it's one of the tools, that's
Right.
all it is. It's a wonderful tool.
Would you say to someone who's starting off as a writer that they should sort of take on that practice of printing and then looking at it and not having the computer?
I don't know about that because that's so personal, but I do say you've got to get up every morning and start at the same time. The only way, in my view, you can become a writer is by writing.
Right. Goes back to the self-discipline.
I'm afraid so.
Yeah. Okay.
It just is.
No, it's fantastic.
And also there's another good thing, you should be short of money. Because it's a very great impulse.
Motivator, yeah.
Yes, for all artists. You read the history of art.
Yeah.
They all needed a few bob and
Yeah.
a couple of shekels here and there.
Right. Let's talk about the creative process of writing. What actually happens? Do you just sort of sit down and something happens internally and you start writing? Or are you affected by your environment, your experiences? In other words, are you proactive or reactive in your writing?
I think it's a mixture of both. I'm going to talk about this in my lecture tomorrow night,
Right.
because it's an important part of my creative process. You inform yourself with certain, over the years, certain things that interest and fascinate and intrigue you.
Mm-hmm.
And when things come into that world, sometimes they spark an idea. If I get an original idea, I always write it as a play. Films, I do mostly adaptation. People send me books, but I've got to know them, that those fit into my world too. I usually start with the people. I don't start, it's got to be in the world, a moral world of choice is what I really write about a lot, the morality of choice.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean I'm moral. You can be a moralist without being moral. That's one of the great things about being a moralist. But if it comes into that world, I know sort of immediately whether it's something for me to write about. And I become intrigued, and I become fascinated, and I become obsessed.
Right.
The obsession is the final phase, and then the putting it down on paper or onto the computer screen is really the last thing you have to do. I always say it's already written. When
Right.
you really are ready to write, it's already written.
Right, like your first novel.
Yeah, well, I didn't know that then, but I've had to
With
think
hindsight.
back about with
Yeah.
hindsight, yes.
So before we finish, you've been here for a few days now, and you're here for almost a week. It's not your first time in Israel. How's your experience been this time?
Well, we've had a lovely time. This might be insulting to Israelis. I find them much more polite than I found them They used to be rather short with me, but they're very sweet now. And fortunately, my wife speaks Russian, so that helps us, because there are a lot of Russian speakers. I wish I spoke Hebrew. I read it, you know, because I was bar mitzvahed.
Mm-hmm.
Of course I can read it, but I can't read it without the vowels.
Right.
Terribly irritating to see the letters, to be able to recognize, but
Yeah.
not be. But I think it's absolutely wonderful. I was just thinking today how mighty Israel is. You just feel its weight and its energy. And last night we went to a lovely area, I'm not going to remember its name, in Tel Aviv, with little restaurants, little cottages. It's very expensive.
Neve Tzedek.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was like being back in Europe, pre-war Europe. It was enchanting. No, I've had a lovely time. And the people have been, I know quite a lot of people here, and they've been enchanting to us.
Sir Ronald, thank you so much for joining us for this eye-opening interview. And good luck tomorrow in your lecture at Tel Aviv University.
I'll need it.
Sir Ronald, thank you very much.
Thank you. She's a pro.